What is going on, you guys? It's your boy. You either focus or you fuck us here, and we are back with episode 154 of the video game therapy series. Um, yeah, I'm kind of coming to appreciate more and more the direct role that, and I'll use the loose term focus, has on our day to day well being. I think people generally, I mean, if you look at their happiest moments, whether I don't think. I guess I'll start by saying I don't think that the pleasure itself is synonymous with happiness. I think pleasure, you could derive happiness, and happiness might even be the wrong word to use here. Maybe I'll say like a full sense of living. Like if you're living your true self, like if you feel most alive, maybe that's probably the best way to do it. Like perhaps the like when you feel most alive, I doubt it would come at a time where all you're experiencing is raw pleasure. Maybe I don't know. Maybe you got a pretty otherworldly blowjob at one point or something. But in general, I think most people feel the most alive, deeply engaged in something, and kind of using their focus. Their focus is kind of at this perfect consistency with the rest of the world and whatever their environment is. So this might be for some people who I don't know love work or school. It's like they're kind of deeply focused at their job, and they're they kind of lost all things. Same with, and you even we don't really appreciate this, but part of the reason we love our friends and to varying degrees our family. Um, Mostly our friends because people always choose their friends. They don't always choose their family, but they enjoy that because they whether they admit this or understand this or not, they often do find themselves in very they're deep in conversation and they wouldn't really call themselves like focused. But I think that's just because we've culturally have kind of imbued the word focus with like productivity, right? And if you're not, you can't really be focused on a conversation, which I think is not true. I think even something as pointless as, this whole exercise is still something that I could be focused on. And there's episodes where I really haven't been focused, and those have not been as enjoyable as those that I really find this area of focus. And I've talked before about kind of this paradox of focus, where you are kind of most locked in when you're not even aware of how locked in you are, right? And it's kind of hard to reach that state because you're like, well, how do I get there? And it's like, well, you almost want to adopt more of an Eastern philosophy towards it, where it's like you kind of let it come to you, you don't seek it out, and it's only when you kind of release your desire to want it, it will come. But even that, it's like the moment you kind of realize that you're in it, it's gone. So this even kind of is true to some extent that I've noticed, in athletic endeavors where like basketball, I'll say as an example. So I play pickup basketball, just in my spare time, and I don't really even think about like the thought of, oh man, I'm playing basketball, I'm having fun. That never occurs to me ever once. It has never occurred to me ever of me thinking about, it's like I'm just so focused on the game and like the next play, even if it's like it's not like a important game. I might be playing with little kids or something who want me to play. It's not like it's always this like important game, but I'm never like self-aware of the fact. I'm not aware of myself beyond just being an active participant in what's going on. So all this to say, I think that finding those experiences and kind of fostering those and fostering an environment where you can kind of achieve this this level of focus where the self-consciousness aspect of our awareness goes away, and you're just we're just kind of left living to be I guess to use a difficult word there. Because again, I think being happy is one thing, but I would also think that like people don't really that while they might seek pleasure, I only think pleasure acts as a means of escape. And while I'm not saying there is no place for pleasure in a good life, certainly a life does have moments of pleasure, but I think you're only really able to enjoy pleasure to the extent necessary once to the degree it's earned. And I also think that there's nothing more pleasurable than getting good things done, or like being in this zone, so to speak, or flow being the word that is tossed around a lot. I just try to avoid words that people have heard before or used, because the moment I say a word that has like a cultural connotation with it, immediately it's met with like the same kind of almost a autonomic like reaction with people. So even just like hot button words, it's like I could say racism or something, but that triggers so many things beyond like, any concept, whether sophisticated or brute of racism, and instead, calls on this like, I don't know, cultural programming that I just can't really compete with in terms of, sharing any opinion that is, that is my own. So I try to be very vague, or at least I'll say generous in my definitions of things, and part of that does serve to kind of obfuscate my point in a way that I guess protects me from a liability perspective in terms of saying things that are ice cold takes. But nonetheless, I do think, I even said before that I do tend to use like slashes a lot and use multiple words in sequence, only because I think people have such strong emotional ties to certain words in their language that it's almost dangerous to use a word by itself. Whereas if I give you two or three different words that kind of are all are synonyms in my eyes, like they all kind of mean the same thing, like that allows you to triangulate, or bifurcate at least the, what I'm meaning when I say this. So I'm not necessarily strictly, referring to, focus or a word like productivity or something. But I might use other like multiple words in succession to then give somebody the idea that like I'm talking about a general concept within the vicinity of these terms. Now, putting your personal grievances with any one word aside, because whether people like to admit it or not, and I will be, I'm open to admitting it. I have relationships, personal relationships with words that can elicit, much more specific emotional responses in me, and I'm aware of that. For example, even like the word productivity or happiness are two words that I don't despise them in the sense that I never want to use them or I hate them. The words are so loaded because they spend so much time in my brain kind of circling around, or even the concept of work, is also one that is incredibly difficult to kind of nail down. Like what people say that they're working, it's like it's what they do for money, or is what they do every day. Because like I would like to think I spend most of my day working, and I don't know how many hours it is. It could be 16 or 18 hours a day, but I say, well, I work 16, 18 hours a day. People are like, what are you talking about? Like, you don't do anything. Like, what do you mean you work 16 hours a day? So we don't really, like, obviously my conception of what work is and your conception are totally different. Work doesn't mean I'm on the clock for somebody else, putting money in my bank account. This might be something I consider work. And it's not up to you to say that this is not work because you wouldn't call that work. In my eyes, anything that, is kind of an active attention or actively requiring my attention and abilities to varying degrees is something I would consider work. So while this requires that I'm like paying attention to this and involved and actively engaged, it's working. Whereas like if I were a lifeguard or something and just staring at the pool, I'm not really doing anything that, I mean, yes, it requires my attention. Actually, it's probably a bad example, but suppose, I'm like, an office job and I just, go outside or something like that. Yes, I'm still technically on the clock and working, but at that time I'm not using my attention actively, right? I'm not really, and that's, again, it's like, again, even using a word like that brings in so many different contexts and notions to people that I while I can't avoid using the word entirely, I do try to at least, you know, con- contextualize or triangulate the term I'm getting at. Ultimately work being like, what you put your skills and attention towards, or something, versus just saying the word work. People are like, well, work is, the amount you're on the clock. It's like, all right, fine, you think that, but that's not, it's just your conception of work. Um, I don't know, that is kind of one of the big pitfalls of language. It is frustrating to me because, I'll say something and then it can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways. And that's great. But that's also horrible because it can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways. And that's kind of true of everything. Like you can't really, even look what this person said. It's like, okay, well, they could say this, but not to defend them at all because maybe I don't like what they said, or maybe I do like what they said, but regardless, it could still be interpreted any number of ways, and very off. It's not often that things are extremely cut and dry. People more or less get the point of what people say, but often the individual words themselves are so cloudy that it's hard to say definitively what any one thing means. And there's an entire profession dedicated to this. It's the legal profession is all trying to like pin down these words. By the legal standard, I think, things are a bit more robust in the sense that, words kind of do mean, this word has this very specific meaning in this context. So we're calling something by that standard. So we can't just, throw that word around because that's not what the legal standard says. Which I'm not advocating for everything becoming this legal argument because believe me, I hate being in the courtroom just as much as the next guy. But at the very least, I do find that's one area of life that there are more standards for using language. Whereas something like poetry or prose is, probably the polar opposite of somewhere like legal profession where, beauty or work or, they has these vague ideas, but they mean wildly different things to different people. And sometimes even polar opposites. But anyway, I don't know how I got started off on that tangent, but yeah, I guess I'll move on to something else. I'm thinking of other, or I'm trying to think of other kind of untimed, non-screen, what I might call like leisure activities. Because I do try to live by the axiom of, Ben Franklin's to refuse idle pleasures. Because I just don't think idle pleasures are, they're not conducive to our best selves. And if there is one thing I do think humanity like has in common, like despite all of our differences, I think, whether or not people want to admit it or embrace this truth, I think there is a duty to develop oneself to their highest ability. Now, again, those words themselves can mean many, many different things to people. But I think, being honest with one's sense of intuition can tell you whether or not you're being, you're working towards developing yourself. And I think idle pleasures, I don't see any role that they would play in developing, yourself. And unless you were, physically and psychologically taxed beyond repair, I think your idle pleasure there could just be sleeping or resting. But again, that's not really a pleasure. That's kind of an idle necessity. But beyond that, I don't see any role for, like passive consumption of media. I'm not to say you have to ignore you can't ever watch a YouTube video ever again for the rest of your life, but it needs to be a intentional activity. So I think the lack of intention is what bothers me in modern culture, is just that, we don't seem to have intentions with anything, or the intentions are so simple and stupid that it's hard to make the argument that this is, towards developing your best self, right? I think, the simple intention of doing something might be, because I get money from it. Okay, fine, that's simple, I guess. And not to say you have to avoid activities just because they're simple in nature, but in general, we should strive for, not more complicated in terms of like, just more stuff going on or just needless complexity. I'm obviously not a proponent of that, but we should strive for increased complexity in terms of difficulty. We should challenge ourselves to be better than we were the day before. It's the same as, in the gym or something. It's like, I think no one would argue that like against the whole idea of progressive overload. There's a reason that is, a largely agreed upon and kind of a law of lifting, is that progressive overload is the way to improve. And I'll say there isn't a time for maintenance. There is, for athletes in season, maintenance is fine. Or if you're coming from an injury, maintenance is fine. But in general, you want to strive to be better than you were, the day or the week or the month before. Like kind of a progress in some notion is highly motivating for us. And I think to avoid that or renounce that as some kind of, non-truth, I think is silly. So in the same way, I think we should apply that same, not in the same concept of progressive overload, but just, progressive difficulty or things ultimately being more challenging for us, because I think it's fun, whether or not people like to, believe that or not. But I think humans are meant to be, challenged in some regular, consistent way in which they can see progress. I think that is one of the main ways that we kind of achieve any sense of happiness or contentedness or well-being. And I think a lot of our modern woes stem from this. A lot of different people have called it many, many different things. The Unabomber called it this power process. The guy in the current book called it like this flow, where you're kind of in this state. But regardless, I think we've hijacked a lot of that, and either, things have become so trivial and easy as to not require any skills or challenge from us at all, and it's just kind of like this kind of feels like an insult, to my humanity. Or are just, or are so unbelievably like far beyond our skill level that we get. It's kind of this chasm between, what the author of my book calls, anxiety and boredom. Boredom being, it's like, well, this is so easy, this is stupid. Like, there's like, yeah, I can do this, and I might need to do this because it's, for food or it's my job or something. But like, this is insultingly dumb. Like, this is not a challenge for me at all. Whereas on the other side of it, it's like someone's like, oh, here's $20, go design a rocket, and it's like, all right, well, how the fuck am I supposed to like that is literally impossible. And it's a state of anxiety. Now, anxiety probably means something different, in his context, whereas the way I might think of anxiety. But in general, that just means like the your skills are nowhere near the necessary. It's like, throwing you in the middle of an NFL football game. It's like you're gonna get absolutely squished. Like it's gonna be over for you. Um, so we want to find things, kind of in that happy medium, and it doesn't matter what it is that, what the nature of the activity is per se, but in general, we should strive for things that aren't, uh, you know, uh, that aren't a detriment to ourselves, and also have to meet that criteria. So, for example, like watching television, how does that meet the criteria of like posing a greater challenge to you on any given day? Like the amount of television requires it requires no skills besides pressing the remote button, and then beyond that, there's no amount of like improvement or increasing challenge every day. And I think I don't know people have their I don't know they have a very sad conception of work time and leisure time, and there's even studies that show that like I hate to be the study show guy or to ever even use that as justification for something, but people often tend to find their most satisfying uh, period of time during like working time. So it's not even like they're enjoying leisure that much more. I think leisure is just sedating, right? And they're not really present within their leisure time. Where I think the people who are truly happy, kind of all around, find ways to enjoy both their leisure and their work time, right? Their work is, equally challenging and satisfying. And I'm not saying that it's easy to, find some kind of occupation or work in any whatever that means to you that is, challenging, but that is kind of the creative challenge at that point is then all right, develop some framework, rules or of, again, progressive difficulty such that you can see incremental improvement and you can increase the difficulty on yourself. Again, not in a way that's going to ever make you, use the word anxious or out of your skill range, or bored really. So it needs to be, you have to find some way to make that happen. So I don't know. An activity like this of me kind of shouting into the void, I've said before how I think more people could benefit just from this because not only do people not have to listen to my problems because I'm saying them in this medium, and then I no longer feel the need to share them with people that I don't have to burden people in my life with these dumb problems. I've said them already. I feel better now. That's kind of all I needed to do socially. And I realize this does represent maybe kind of a sad antisocial development in terms of, I guess, society in the sense that I don't feel like I should be burdening other people with, what I talk about in these videos, and instead I have to just put them on a, essentially a burner YouTube channel. But regardless, technology advances. This is ultimately where we're left. So I feel like this is again the best challenge and thing I can do for myself at this time, given the way that society and culture is run. The other part of that being that I think, listening in general is in high demand now, and people are notoriously bad at kind of understanding or listening, or and again, even the word listening might have its own connotation with people, so it's hard to use that word without without me feeling the need to define it even more. But in general, I don't think most people disagree in the sense that people are very bad listeners. Besides even therapists that are quite literally paid to listen, most people, like friends and family, are often not interested at all, and don't really feign even the act of listening to somebody, which is unfortunate. But in this case, because I'm saying it's being recorded, in theory it could be played any number of times. I feel like it has a greater chance of being listened to, at the very least, even just by myself. Like, there's a rare occasion where I'll listen to one of my own little banterings and come away with at least insight about myself, or whether that's growth or regression, or just even just something interesting or something. Or something stupid, which I will now segue into, because this did kind of come up today and bothered me. How the fuck does anyone use plastic wrap properly? Like, I think it is a skill beyond. I mean, that is a challenge beyond my skill level. Is using plastic wrap to wrap anything, and I don't know if it's just the serrations on the edge of the box are dull, or I just buy the wrong boxes of plastic wrap that don't work well. But for whatever reason, every time I try to do anything, I end up either wanting to grab scissors to cut them manually, or I end up just kind of molesting the plastic and just ripping it off in some horrible way. And then, of course, the only part of the food that I wanted to cover is left exposed because I didn't rip it off cleanly, and I wasn't able to do that. So I don't know if it's a quick motion. I don't know if it's a slow motion. I don't know what the mechanics are for using plastic wrap, and I'm not getting any better at it the more I use it. So it is that has been something that has been bothering me. Is this break again? Whatever. Anyway, that is that was my brief aside. More complaining about the world because I think most people would agree that modern architecture is kind of ugly, or at the very least, just unsophisticated. It's not even like it represents or is similar to like our futuristic ideas of the future. It's like it's not even like they're sleek, kind of. They more resemble like prisons than they like really any piece of modern architecture. More closely resembles a prison than it does any bastion of modern technology, which I think is is kind of telling for where we're at. But also even beyond that, I think, including the excluding the architecture. I think people, on average, have gotten uglier, and I don't know why. Part of this has to do with the weight problem. Yes, I understand. That phobia streak in me will come up again. But even beyond that, I think it's just people don't dress well anywhere. I mean, even at nicer restaurants, people walk in with sweatpants. And again, I'm not one to like be shallow about the way one looks. Again, I'm the last person to be making judgments about things, but I think there is a certain, it does say something if it's one thing to like be poor because again I've spent a lot of my time. I'm still poor actually, but ultimately like I think the standard for like being poor and looking bad versus just like not caring at all about how you look whatsoever are two different things. And I think in general now it's quite obvious to me that most people do not give a motherfuck how they look at all, in any sense of the word. Physically, their fashion, the way they carry themselves, like how they speak to people. Because even, I don't know, socially, you want to, I'm not saying you're a different person than someone ages you, but with a stranger, you should at least, like, have a sense of cordiality and be like, at least appear to be like a fellow human, trapped in the same, bed of meat as the other person, but now I think like people are so removed from that they don't even want to put on the the attractive, even just like their best kind of interviews for something. I'm not saying you need to go to everything dressed like a job interview and then treat everyone like you're the president or something. I guess it depends on who you think whoever you want the president to be treated like that. But I still think there is the standard has been slipping, and part of this, or most of this probably, is just as a result of our antisocial tendencies kind of popping up and being more of a mainstay. Just in general, culture is moving towards more antisociality. Ironically, with the advent of social media, people spend more time online. People are more antisocial and therefore don't really develop the skills or just the habits of not being. All right, I don't know what was going on with my microphone, but hopefully that's fixed now. I guess I'll try to fix that in post. Whatever. I think just in general, people don't really practice the habits of being sociable or preparing for social events. So, when social events do come up, people are, quick to make it kind of a big deal, and they, then, spend more time kind of stressing and being anxious about social events, which is good that they still, see them as important in some vague sense. But unfortunate in the sense that it becomes this kind of rare thing that they have to like dress up and look nice, where it's like kind of every day you should kind of present yourself at some minimum of acceptability, right? Where I think people kind of tend to view like everything, a larger and larger percentage of the world is now just like their living room, right? They can go anywhere in sweatpants, they don't care, right? They like this, they wear this kind of gross, mean look on their face. And I'm not saying I don't mean mug, I do mean mug, but my face is not like a bleh face. There's an intensity to my mean mug. I agree with that, but it's not, my face is still intentionally kind of tight. Whereas I think a lot of people's like their face is just like they're not even paying attention to the way they're carrying themselves. And again, maybe that's just like a weird kind of I don't know, autistic quirk of what I'm focusing on. But at the very least, I find it disappointing that people don't take more pride in their appearance. Obviously beyond just the physical part that is has bother me to no end in all of these videos. Yeah. I guess speaking of being kind of trapped in a, I guess a big ball of meat, that is kind of one very interesting, or one kind of weird abstraction to think about our lives is that we are kind of these, imagine like a, regular human, but just kind of trapped in like this box. And one side of the box is, a big glass pane that is, kind of what we see. There are speakers in there kind of playing out. But we're kind of left to figure out what to do, because we're kind of stuck in this, we're stuck in this giant box. And sure, there are things, in front of us, with at the glass that are, kind of worth watching and are interesting. And we hear things that are interesting too. We can kind of focus on those. But I think some people, tend to, they kind of view themselves as that, and so it's a very passive, passive abstraction on, what their life is, versus I think the better way to live is to take a more active role in that. So if you are a person that is trapped in a box with, proverbial human brain is what this box is supposed to represent. Kind of taking an active role in organizing thoughts and things that come in. So, as you see things through the big glass pane, I'm assuming you have maybe some basic materials in there, like, pencil and paper or something like that, or at least an ability to make markings. You can even draw blood and, make markings in that way. As weird, as prison-like as that is. But I think most people have, they realize that they're in this kind of meat prison, for lack of a better word. Whether or not this truly is the way that, they are is still up for debate. But instead of like, okay, I'm in a meat prison, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Instead of trying to find active things to, have their attention and give them tasks and kind of ordering the chaos of, what they see and what they hear, they instead just kind of lay down and just do nothing and try to look for, just try to derive the maximum amount of pleasure in things. Which I think scientifically is, where a lot of, kind of these arguments end up is that, if you are, again, a strict reductionist materialist, there is really nothing beyond pleasure that, is the purpose of life, which I think is silly and stupid. I've said many, many times before. But beyond all of that, I think accepting, even using that to justify a passive existence is a reprehensible sin, is one that, you'll ultimately pay for with your life. But I think your life should be taking an active role. And people, you have there's no shortage of excuses with regard to, to that. Even, it's like, well, if I only had more money, then I could, then I could actually do what I wanted to do. It's like, well, if I had more of this and it's like, well, no, I think even if I did trap you in a literal prison, you could still live the good life. You just need, you need to have what you need inside your head, right? And I think that's maybe what my whole point of this is everything you need to live a satisfactory life is kind of already within you. It's only a matter of you both organizing and kind of accepting or understanding, what it is that goes on in your head and what and how how those things relate to your outside experience. Because there's many stories, and I've read a lot of them through books and things. Of people that are trapped in these horrible situations, solitary confinement or prison or, the Holocaust or something. And the ones that make it out aren't the ones that give up hope or like, man, this sucks. God, this is terrible. I want to go home. Those aren't the ones that make it through. Those people die every time. They don't last that long. The ones that do make it through find almost like silly, childish ways of existing, right? They just all right, I'm going to count, every stripe on the fence or something like that, and I'm gonna see if I'm gonna guess whether it's an even or odd number. I'm gonna do that for every I'm gonna do that every day for the next year. And it's as stupid and as juvenile as that little system is, it's like a grown man or like a mathematician or something doing that. And as stupid as that sounds, that is ultimately what gets people through horrible situations. So especially if you find yourself in a situation that you at least don't want to be permanent, or don't you're likening to the Holocaust or something. At the very least, again, start counting stripes on the fence, right? Do something that requires your active attention and demands your focus on something. I think that will ultimately lead you out of gives you something that the guards can't take away no matter what. Even if they take away your free time, fine, make another game. And I think the movie, what was it, Shawshank Redemption, paints this very well. Obviously his was a more obvious distraction of like, all right, I'm going to dig a hole out of here. Like that's a very obvious and a very Hollywood, version of this. But in the more realistic sense, like you'll have to do something that is, eventually pointless. Like someone's going to go into your, jail cell and go, why did this guy make all these markings in here? What was he counting? Like the grains of rice or something that he's been eating or whatever. As pointless as it is, but that's still ultimately what will entertain your mind. If you're trapped in this meat prison and you're viewing it as such, you have to have something that to keep your mind occupied. And I think we're naturally very wary of being bored, and we don't like being bored, and we find the human mind is very creative and powerful ways of kind of overcoming boredom. And I think if you allow yourself to be bored, you'd be surprised what kind of little games and little ideas and things you come up with. And the important thing is not to disregard them as foolish or silly because, they're not important in the grand scheme of things. Like even, I'll use an example of me, something less torturous, like, being good at bowling. Like, yeah, as inconsequential as bowling is to anyone else, and even myself really, in the grand scheme of things, it still can ultimately occupy, my attention and, can provide me greater and greater challenges every day and give me something to kind of work towards. Especially if, the goals that you are currently setting and you work towards, you're having trouble making any progress. So, so let's say you have financial goals that you want to achieve and you've made them for like a couple years in a row and you're barely making any progress or it's very disheartening. Again, think less concretely, think more abstractly. What are other goals that are completely independent of that, right? Or aren't so to the whims of other people. Like you can't control whether or not you're going to get a raise. You can't control whether or not your boss is going to give you overtime. You can't control not whether you're even going to have a job, right? You could get fired, and that could be the end of it. But so instead of thinking in that very concrete way, which we're kind of trained to do, in modern culture, instead kind of think abstractly in things that you surely can't control all of, right? Games just kind of inside your head. Just I guess other things beyond external external things. Because in general, I think we are too externally focused. I think if we were to have a path to salvation as a prevailing culture and generation, I think that path to salvation does not lie in any external technology revolution. It simply lies in our ability to supersede our external circumstances, and that is maybe where my whole beef with technologists boils down into. Is that they view the panacea to our future to be some kind of technological one or some mechanical one where we're kind of learning or we discover some new thing that's going to solve all of our problems. Our problems are entirely in our own head, right? That is where the problems are, right? Even imagined or real problems, even problems as concrete as like starving to death is still like something you could technically transcend. Like, there's protesters, in India that have starved to death, because their ideology was more important to them than food. So it's not even like starving to death is something that like supersedes all mental abilities. Your mind is technically powerful enough to disregard its own physical needs. And if it's powerful enough to do that, what's to say it's not powerful enough to make, whatever your situation is into one that is most favorable for its, its survival and its existence, and one that can be happy. So you could, it is, again, technically possible, albeit difficult, I'll admit, to be happy in any external, like any circumstance whatsoever, including poverty, including all of that, which is not reassuring for people who are in poverty or, are having those kinds of troubles. I understand that, it's not a very, it's not a very hopeful message. It's like, all right, well then just sit down in a room and figure out by yourself how to transcend your horrible external circumstance. Especially as things get desperate, if things get desperate, the human mind doesn't love despair, right? Despair doesn't, it is not a conducive mindset to growth. But I think we're so trained to think of, kind of these strange, silly games or things that, we're trained to think of so many things as inconsequential that, we kind of laugh at ourselves when we, create some new little abstraction or some new little organization for us. Even, I guess I could use an example in my life. I have all these little cards, right? I use cardstock. I print them out. I use cards for everything to keep track of, the lifting, my daily plans, literally everything, from one way or the other ends up on a stupid card. And I realize the absurdity of that. And you have no idea how many people have come to me and go, well, why don't you just write this down like in a spreadsheet or a document or something? And for one reason, it's like, I like the tangible card feel of it. That's, one, I guess one reason I use the cards over anything else. But the other reason is that this is just simply my system that I've generated. I understand that this is entirely pointless. Like there's no, if I didn't do the cards, nothing would happen, right? In fact, I would just have less things to do during the day. But I think part of what, how I'm able to stay sane in prolonged periods of solitude is I have these little cards, this little organizational system that means nothing to everybody, like to nobody but me. And there's nobody requiring me to do this. There's no reward. I'm not building towards anything. I'm not collecting them to build a paper airplane or something. I'm literally doing nothing besides having these cards to help organize my thoughts and organize my day. And no one sees them. They don't go anywhere. They're not used for anything. They're not even used as firewood or anything, or timber or something. But I do them because I think it provides a lot of order and consistency in my life and gives me some way to see progress, right? If I complete a card, let's say I have a lifting card. Let's like I do the lift, I write down all the stuff that I do. Again, I'm never going to look at this again. I'm not going to codify it. I don't care. I put it in my little box of finished cards, and there's something there's satisfying about that process, that kind of start to finish process of, I completed this, I had a goal, did this, now I can do that, and I can make progressively more difficult cards. I've instituted new cards for other things, and this is just my like weird dumb system of doing things. And I assume other people might be happier with a spreadsheet or just something different other than cards. But that is one way that I've found to organize my life, and it allows me, I think, much greater freedom. Ironically, because I think there was a like a Plato quote that's like freedom is found in like, yeah, or liberation is found in like a lack of freedom or something. Or like even the example of like choosing to marry one person over another. Now that you've chosen, assuming you're monogamous, now that you've chosen this one person, you no longer ever have to consider, you're now free, you're free of the burden of thinking of like, who should I be with or whatever. So now that you've chosen, it's like that burden is now relieved from you. You no longer have to think about who you're going to marry or whether or not this person's better than the other person. But what people do is they don't really have that commitment and don't commit themselves to a restrictive ideology or workflow. In my case, the cards. Like the cards are the way I organize my life. So things are on the cards, and while it may be inefficient or not ideal for some circumstance or the other, I've still committed myself entirely to the cards. So that way, like all the other options are gone. I don't think about the spreadsheets. I don't use Google Docs or whatever. I'm not paying for a subscription. I'm not doing any of that because I've committed myself to the cards. So when you commit to a person to be in a monogamous relationship with, you then no longer have to consider other options. Like you're kind of more free now because you spend less time thinking about like, well, what about that person? What about this person? But I think people tend to spend so much time comparing and contrasting, think like trying to work out what's optimal. But I think commitment has a way of making whatever you chose being the best possible, being the right answer, in some way. So I think in a lot of ways, commitment can be incredibly freeing, right? You can be very liberating to commit to something fully and not waver and not be unsure or something. Um, but I think that's kind of paradoxical because people are very much min-maxing now and everything has to be this optimal choice. When the kind of the base answer is the choice is what you've chosen, what you've committed to. Like that is the best option, because of your commitment. Now, if you're wishy-washy on everything, it doesn't matter which one. Even if you choose, we'll say even the quote-unquote objectively best option, you're still in flux in terms of your commitment. So you're not going to be that it won't be the optimal option. But anyway, I'll move on to something else here. I guess I'll speak in of bad times too, just because I'm kind of riffing a little bit on that. A shitty day goes by just as fast as a good one, So it's like even if you are having even a string of consecutive bad days, as fast, because at least our conception of time. Now there is kind of a more philosophical history with time. Like I think the old uh, Socratic thinkers had two different types of time. There was like the objective time; they called it something I don't remember what it was called. And they had another one that was kind of your subjective time. And when you were, when people were doing things like when they were kind of lost in the day-to-day activity of doing things, their subjective time obviously went by very fast, but the objective time still kind of went by at the same, slow crawl. And everyone has that experience of, an afternoon or something where things just kind of chug along very slowly. There's not a whole lot, that kind of, that passage of time versus the one where it's like you're having a blast and the whole day just kind of goes by without you. But again, anchoring yourself to the objective time, it goes by just as quickly, whether or not the day is good or bad. So, as quickly as a good day can end, a bad day, or quickly as a good day can begin, a bad day can end. So, I don't know. It's worth, it could be worth thinking of that in that sense, especially when you're having a bad day and you need to think about, just it ending or something. Anyway, I guess another topic on just kind of modern malaise of people is, I've noticed, and this is kind of increasingly true as younger kids are forced into occupations because of more practical concerns and less about what is intrinsically motivating them. But where this leads is what I just call like putting yourself in a skill prison. So, for an example, a young child sees that astronaut, or not even astronauts, they don't make any money. I guess they see the computer people make a ton of money, right? And I guess this is back in 2010 or something. So the parents are like, well, you have to be a computer scientist because like that's where all the money is. And it's like, well, I don't really like computer science. I like the violin. It's like, well, fuck you. That doesn't matter. It's not going to do anything. So then, like, you're running the risk of like, yeah, computer scientists are in high demand now, but maybe not in the future. And lo and behold, of course, no one wants a computer scientist anymore. So like, that as an example is kind of ironic. But chosen on purpose. But but not only that, but what you're good at, you hate doing, right? So it's like the skill prison that you're in is, what you're capable and what you're qualified to do, you don't even like doing. Like you hate it. Whereas like at the very least, if you liked what you did, even if you did, not make any money, you'd at least like enjoy what you did, and as a result, I would argue you'd be much better at what you do. But I don't think people in skill prisons are ever rise to the top of their craft. So if you force your kid to be a doctor and expect him to be the best doctor ever, unless he wants to be a doctor and is intrinsically motivated to be a doctor, he will never be at the top of his game, or top of his craft, because he is not intrinsically motivated to do that. Now, one could, you could relearn, like I just said before, about kind of reorienting your external circumstances and reorienting your inner mind to relate to those circumstances in a more desirable way. You can learn to enjoy the process of being the doctor, and then, subsequently then could become, the best doctor or whatever. But in general, you're fighting a more uphill battle where, if you choose something that you are, intrinsically motivated and interested in doing, you're much more likely to, again, going to rise to the top of your craft at that. So, I don't know. I just thought that idea of a skill prison was funny because so many people seem to like, oh, well, I'm a nurse. And it's like, oh, so, do you like, it's like, no, I hate it. It's like, all right, well, some of that maybe is like they didn't know what they were getting into and they did that. And, that's understandable. But I think many more people choose these careers out of purely practical considerations, not realizing that not only are they taking, they're taking a practical bet, assuming that doctors are always going to be in high demand or engineers are always in high demand, or like we just don't know, especially now with the economy. But then B, like, suppose you are even right, then again, the only thing that you're qualified to do and good at, you hate doing. So you're literally in a prison of your own making. And I guess you can blame your parents for it, but then, it's ultimately up to you to kind of fix your problems. And there's one, more kind of sobering thought I had today. I watched a kid being pushed in a shopping cart, and he was in the shopping cart, and of course, in front of him was this like just enormous iPad, like one of the biggest iPads I've ever seen. I didn't know they made iPads. I mean, it must be like a 22-inch iPad. I mean, it was like hilariously big. And I was like, I'm not saying that kid is screwed. Like, I'm not even gonna take the black pill on that. But his parents, without knowing, are making his life much more difficult for him. Right, so I think they're like, they're obviously doing what they think is reasonable at that time, but I'm then going to criticize what their decision, and saying that is going to make his life harder to have to dig out, of a phone addiction or just an unhealthy relationship with a screen that ultimately he himself is going to have to be responsible for fixing. Right, no one's going to, there's not going to be a drug or something that's going to solve that problem. He's going to have to work himself out of that hole. And I do, largely believe in the power of the human spirit, the indomitable human spirit to then kind of transcend even these, more cataclysmic problems. But ultimately, I don't think making it more difficult on your children is a good thing, and I think parents would agree with that. But maybe they just don't see the correlation between media consumption in a passive a passive relationship with technology and the world. That's not, they don't see how dangerous that is, and not conducive to a healthy lifestyle or a healthy way of relating to the world. I guess, to put it that way. But I don't know. I do, as unoptimistic and as as doomer as I sound in a lot of these videos, I do believe the human spirit is more powerful than that. I just know how, I know it's going to get harder and harder and harder for people, and it's going to require more and more of them. And maybe that is good in the sense that it creates, more giga chads, I guess, to put it that way, making people more and more capable. But ultimately, like, with every big upheaval, with every big social upheaval becomes, a lot of change, a lot of transition, and, unfortunately, a lot of sacrifice in people. And not, not saying like a literal sacrifice in the sense that a bunch of people are going to die, but I also do kind of mean that I think a lot of people are going to die as a result of these, decisions that, were made by, made one at a time. There was Zuckerberg made the first decision, and then, then it was parents to do that. Then it was companies to embrace this. And there's all these little decisions down the line that lead to, our cultural dependence on a lot of these things that, will ultimately backfire. And I do think we'll eventually course correct and fix things out. But it's just we're making more and more work for ourselves over the long term. So it's not, we have a deep hole to dig ourselves out of. And it's not one that, more iPads is going to make easier. But that being said, I do think that we'll eventually find the way out. My last thing is just a little stupid quip. Nothing is real until somebody believes in it somewhere. So even, I don't know, something as silly as like, so, I am the most beautiful person of all time, or something, dumb like that. That isn't real at all, really, until somebody then first declares that. Once that is declared by somebody, then it's real. Again, I'll be quote unquote real in the eyes of this silly person who thinks that they're the most beautiful person ever. But nonetheless, that is something that is now brought into existence and is believed by one person. Now, over time, you can get other people to then believe that same thing, and soon enough, maybe everyone thinks that you're the most beautiful person in the world, or at least there's a subset, or at least a group of people, maybe starting with your family or something, that now believe that you are the most beautiful person in the world. But over time, like, if you want anything to be true at all, someone has to believe in it. And more often than not, especially if it's your idea, the first person that has to believe in said idea is you. You have to believe in it. So, let's take a more concrete example, or a less silly one about being the most beautiful. Let's just like, okay, I want to be a firefighter. It's like, or I'm going to be a firefighter. It's not like I want to be. It's like the belief is I'm going to be a firefighter. It's like that doesn't exist until you declare it to yourself, I'm going to be a firefighter. And it's like, okay, fine. Then you go down to the fire station. And this is, again, you could apply this to anything. I'm just using an example. And you go down to the fire station, you apply for a job, and they go, okay, good. We'll consider you for a firefighter. Now it's like, all right, that seed of, such and such is a firefighter is now kind of planted in this person's head. And now it's like, 1.5 people that kind of believe this. Let's say you go down there, you do the test in front of the judges. Now there's 6 people that all think that, okay, such and such passed the test or whatever they would have to do. Now they're a firefighter. Now it's you plus 6 other people that all think, all right, such and such is a firefighter. Then it's like, all right, you fight fires for a while, you do whatever. You, I guess, be a firefighter for a long time. And then all of a sudden, like, the community knows. It's like, all right, everyone knows that you're a firefighter. Your coworkers, okay, such and such, he's a firefighter. But it's like that whole thing, like, everything started with you yourself saying, hey, I'm gonna be a firefighter. Like, I'm gonna say it out loud to myself. I'm gonna believe it, and then I'm going to take the steps actionable for it to be a reality. And that is, I think, the first step in kind of any sort of I'll say, like, transformational progress is one person needs to believe it, and oftentimes the first person isn't your mom or somebody else or your therapist or whoever. It is you. You have to be the first person to believe it. for it to be true. And then slowly you have to kind of convince other people to believe its truth. And then soon enough, whatever, that pipe dream was at some point, at one point, is now your reality. It's like you're a firefighter. Now, I'm not. I'm assuming there's not a whole lot of people that are aspirational firefighters, in chat or whatever. But again, you could apply this to any occupation, I want to be an artist, or I want to have a family, right? It's like, okay, fine, you got to convince a girl, I want to have a family. It's all right. Well, we can have the family. It's all right. Good. Now we're both in on it. Now there's two people. Then you get married, have a wedding. Everyone's at the wedding. They're in on it now. Now everyone thinks that there's a family. So it's like you can kind of build this truth over time, but it starts with you believing in this. So nothing is real until someone believes it, and oftentimes the first person that needs to believe it, if it's something you want to do, is you. So anyway, I'll leave it off there. I'm gonna go kill these withers and fix that audio problem. But thanks for watching. Peace out.